Channel Tragedy, the deadly cost of Britain's border crisis. Right, let's get straight to it. If you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, hit that button now because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view Britain's immigration crisis. Today's events in the English Channel aren't just another news story. They're a damning indictment of a system that's been failing for years, and frankly, it's about time someone said it properly. This afternoon, as helicopters circled the grey waters of the Dover Strait and emergency services scrambled to save lives, we witnessed yet another preventable tragedy unfold in real time. At least one person is confirmed dead, dozens thrown into the freezing Channel waters when their overcrowded dinghy began to deflate. And before you think this is just another unfortunate accident, let me be absolutely clear. This is a direct consequence of political failure at the highest levels of British government. The INLI lifeboats, those brave souls who risk everything to pull people from the water, were tasked by HM Coast Guard to what they diplomatically called incidents in the Channel. Incidents. That's the sanitized language we use when people die trying to reach our shores. Border Force catamarans Ranger, Volunteer, and Typhoon made multiple voyages, their crews working frantically as Coast Guard helicopters winched survivors from the water. At Dover's western docks, ambulances waited alongside Coast Guard trucks, a scene that became horrifyingly routine. But here's what should make your blood boil. Over 500 migrants are believed to have crossed the Channel today alone. 500. Just days after 1,097 were recorded making the same treacherous journey. These aren't isolated incidents. They are part of a relentless tide that shows no sign of abating, and every single crossing represents a failure of deterrence policy that successive governments have promised but never delivered. And if you think the government's response has been adequate, think again. Make sure you're subscribed because I'll be breaking down exactly why their strategies have been nothing short of catastrophic. The people smugglers, these modern-day pirates who profit from human misery, have adapted their cruel methods with ruthless efficiency. Sources tell us that today's dinghy began deflating as it entered British territorial waters. Whether this was mechanical failure or deliberate sabotage matters little to the families now mourning their loved ones. What matters is that these criminal networks continue to operate with apparent impunity whilst our politicians engage in performative politics rather than effective action. Let me paint you the picture from Dover today. Helicopters circling overhead like vultures, emergency vehicles lined up at the port, rescue crews pulling bodies from the water. This isn't some distant humanitarian crisis we can ignore. This is happening 12 miles from the Kent coast, in waters that should be among the most secure in the world. Yet here we are, watching people drown whilst politicians argue about Rwanda schemes that never materialize and detention policies that never work. The INLI, bless them, continues to do what they've always done, save lives without question or judgment. But let's be honest about what's happening here. We created a system where our maritime rescue services have become, in effect, a taxi service of illegal immigration. Not through any fault of their own, but because successive governments have failed to address the root causes of this crisis or create safe, legal routes that might prevent these dangerous crossings. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more hard truths about Britain's political failures, because what I'm about to tell you about the government's response will leave you questioning everything. Today's tragedy follows a familiar pattern. Boats launched from French beaches under cover of darkness, overcrowded and unseaworthy, piloted by people who've never seen the sea before. The people smugglers take their money, thousands of pounds per person, and disappear into the night, leaving desperate families to navigate one of the world's busiest shipping lanes in vessels that would struggle in a boating lake. When things go wrong, as they inevitably do, it's left to British taxpayers to fund the rescue operations whilst French authorities shrug their shoulders and count the EU money they receive for coastal patrols that seem remarkably ineffective. The human cost is staggering, but so is the financial burden. Each border force operation costs thousands, every helicopter deployment runs into tens of thousands, and the accommodation costs of processing migrants runs into hundreds of millions annually. Yet still they come, because the message being sent is crystal clear. If you can survive the crossing, you'll likely be allowed to stay. Coast Guard sources describe today's rescue operation in clinical terms: multiple assets deployed, coordinated response, ongoing incident management. Behind this bureaucratic language lies a desperate scramble to prevent what could have been a mass casualty event. The fact that only one death has been confirmed so far is testament to the professionalism of our rescue services, not the adequacy of our prevention policies. And here's the uncomfortable truth that no politician wants to acknowledge. Every successful crossing encourages 10 more attempts. Every rescue operation, however necessary and humanitarian, serves as marketing material for the criminal gangs who profit from this trade. We're trapped in a cycle where our moral obligation to save lives inadvertently perpetuates the very crisis that puts those lives at risk. Hit subscribe now if you want to hear more uncomfortable truths about how we got into this mess and why conventional solutions aren't working. The international dimension of this crisis reveals a complete inadequacy of our current approach. France receives substantial funding from both the UK and EU for coastal security, yet boats continue to launch with apparent ease. European human rights legislation prevents us from implementing the kind of robust deportation policies that might actually deter dangerous crossings. Meanwhile, international criminal networks operate with sophisticated logistics that would put legitimate businesses to shame. What we witness today in the Channel waters, the helicopters, the rescue boats, the ambulances waiting at Dover, this is Britain in 2025. A nation that once ruled the waves now unable to secure 12 miles of water from its own coastline. Our maritime borders have become a revolving door, our rescue services overwhelmed, and our processing system completely broken. The political response will be predictably inadequate. Opposition parties will call for more funding, government ministers will promise tougher measures, and civil servants will write reports that no one reads. Meanwhile, the smuggling networks will adapt their tactics, more boats will launch from French beaches, and more families will risk everything on unseaworthy vessels. But let's talk about the human reality behind today's statistics. Somewhere tonight, a family is mourning someone who died trying to reach Britain. Perhaps a father who left everything behind to give his children a better future, or a mother fleeing persecution, or a young person whose only crime was being born in the wrong place. Their death in the Channel waters represents both a personal tragedy and a systemic failure that implicates us all. The cruel irony is that many of these people might qualify for legal asylum if they could access proper procedures. Instead, they are forced into the hands of criminals who see them as cargo, not human beings. The lack of safe, legal routes doesn't prevent migration. It just makes it more dangerous and more profitable for the wrong people. Subscribe to UK Connors for more analysis that cuts through the political rhetoric to the harsh realities beneath. Today's events also highlight the impossible position we put our frontline services in. Border Force officers, Coast Guard crews, INLI volunteers, they signed up to serve their country and save lives, not to manage a humanitarian crisis that politicians refuse to solve. They perform miracles daily, pulling people from freezing waters, providing medical care to the desperate, and maintaining their humanity whilst dealing with an impossible situation. The Dover community, too, bears the burden of this crisis. Local services stretched, infrastructure overwhelmed, residents watching daily as a town becomes a focal point of a problem they didn't create and can't solve. The Western Docks, once a symbol of Britain's maritime heritage, now serve as a processing center for the consequences of policy failure. What makes today's tragedy particularly galling is its predictability. The weather conditions, the tide patterns, the seasonal migration trends, all of this is known and monitored. Yet still we find ourselves reacting to crises rather than preventing them. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing exactly what's going to happen but being powerless to stop it. The international community watches Britain struggle with what is, in global terms, a relatively small number of migrants. Other nations deal with refugee populations in the millions, whilst we declare a national emergency over thousands. This isn't to diminish the real challenges, but rather to highlight how our political discourse has become completely detached from reality. Make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'll be examining why every government solution has failed, and what a realistic approach might actually look like. The smuggling networks themselves operate with ruthless business efficiency that puts legitimate companies to shame. They've identified a market need, safe passage to Britain, and exploited regulatory gaps to meet that demand. They adapt to enforcement measures faster than governments can implement them, using everything from social media marketing to sophisticated logistics networks. Today's deflating dinghy might have been sabotage, a way to ensure rescue services pick up their human cargo rather than risk deportation. The French dimension of this crisis deserves particular scrutiny. Despite receiving substantial funding for coastal security, boats continue to launch with apparent ease from French beaches. Whether this represents institutional failure, deliberate indifference, or simple acknowledgement that the problem is unsolvable remains unclear. What is clear is that current cooperation agreements aren't working. The legal framework surrounding these crossings creates perverse incentives that no politician wants to acknowledge. International maritime law requires rescue of anyone in distress at sea, regardless of their legal status. Human rights legislation prevents immediate deportation of asylum claimers. European court judgments override domestic policy preferences. The result is a system where dangerous crossings are rewarded with entry to the UK, however temporary. Today's helicopter operations over Dover represent the visible tip of a vast iceberg of institutional failure. Behind every rescue operation lie months of intelligence reports ignored, diplomatic negotiations that achieved nothing, and policy announcements that were never properly implemented. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as its various components were designed, just not towards any coherent overall objective. The human tragedy unfolding in the Channel reflects broader failures of Western policy towards global displacement. Climate change, economic inequality, and political persecution are driving unprecedented levels of migration, yet our response remains rooted in 20th century thinking about borders and sovereignty. We're trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century tools. Subscribe now for more analysis that goes beyond the headlines to examine root causes and realistic solutions. What happened today? The death in the Channel, the emergency response, the arrival of another 500 migrants. This will repeat itself tomorrow, next week, next month. Until we acknowledge the fundamental inadequacy of our current approach, we'll continue to witness preventable tragedies whilst pretending that the next policy announcement will somehow solve everything. The rescue services will continue doing their jobs with professionalism and humanity. The politicians will continue making promises they can't keep. The smugglers will continue adapting their methods. And desperate people will continue risking everything on unseaworthy boats because they believe the danger is worth it. Britain deserves better than this endless cycle of crisis and inadequate response. The people risking their lives in Channel waters deserve better than a system that forces them into the hands of criminals. Our frontline services deserve better than being asked to manage the consequences of political failure. Today's tragedy in the Channel isn't just another news story. It's a stark reminder that current policies aren't just failing, they are deadly. Until we acknowledge this reality and start having honest conversations about realistic solutions, more helicopters will circle Dover waters, more ambulances will wait at the docks, and more families will mourn loved ones lost to political failure. That's why UK Connors exists, to cut through the political rhetoric and examine the uncomfortable realities that mainstream discourse ignores. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and join us as we continue exposing the truth behind Britain's biggest challenges. Because until we start talking honestly about these problems, we'll never solve them. And people will keep dying in the Channel whilst politicians pretend their latest announcement changes anything. The question isn't whether this will happen again, it's whether we'll finally decide to do something about it.